What would you do if your entire town turned against you, just because you showed kindness to the wrong person? In a quiet corner of Fairview, a black woman running a struggling diner made one bold choice to defend a sick biker against two officers. That simple act of humanity cost her everything, until the sound of 200 engines rolling into town changed her life forever. This isn't just a story about justice. It's about loyalty, courage, and how one act of compassion can bring a forgotten town back to life. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you speechless. In the quiet heart of Fairview, Texas, where the town's best days had long since faded into dust and memory, a small diner named Brooklyn Table sat nestled between an abandoned hardware store and a shuttered pharmacy, its chipped red awning flapping gently in the dry morning breeze. Inside, Danielle Brooks moved with practiced precision, her motions worn and rhythmic like an old song only she remembered. At 32, she bore the weary grace of someone who had learned to endure without expecting applause. Her dark curls were pulled back into a frayed bun, her apron dusted with flour and ghost traces of yesterday's fry oil, and her hands once skilled and tender as a nurse were now toughened from months of labor, from scrubbing, lifting, surviving. The diner's walls, yellowed by time, still held echoes of laughter and clinking cutlery. But these days silence reigned, broken only by the creaking ceiling fan above and the occasional sputter of the old coffee maker that groaned like it shared her exhaustion. Danielle paused behind the counter, gazing into the antique register, its drawer half open, revealing a sad clutch of dollar bills and coins that seemed to shrink each time she counted them. She didn't need to count again to know it wasn't enough, not for the looming utility cutoff notice folded deep in her bag, not for the rising nursing home bills for her father, nor for the groceries she hadn't bought this week. Still, she whispered the same hollow promise she had every morning for the last 10 months. Just a little longer. She had left her job as an oncology nurse in Houston after the stroke took her father's voice and his independence. Returning to Fairview hadn't been a choice, it had been a vow. She couldn't abandon the man who had raised her with grit, gospel, and unshakable dignity, and she couldn't let his dream, the Brooklyn Table, become just another boarded-up shell in a town already drowning in closed signs and broken hope. Outside Main Street was still asleep, bathed in the golden hush of sunrise. The windows across the road were blank with dust. Their displays faded, their doors long locked. Danielle could feel the weight of it all pressing against the glass of her diner. The weight of a dying town, of being a black woman running a business in a place that looked at her more with nostalgia than respect. But she stayed, not for the town, not even for the customers who no longer came. She stayed because this diner was the last light of her father's legacy, and she was the one holding the match. It was just past 9:30 a.m. when the bell above the door gave a sharp, unfamiliar jingle, and Danielle's hand froze mid-wipe on the counter. In a town where she could predict every face that walked in Joe from the feed store, the Matthews twins from the post office, even the occasional drifter headed west, this silhouette didn't fit. Framed by the morning sun was a tall, broad man cloaked in worn black leather, his jacket faded but unmistakably marked with a circular patch stitched over his heart. Iron Sun's MC, a skeletal eagle soaring through crossed pistons, grim and bold, his boots dust-caked and cracked, hit the tile floor with the slow, heavy rhythm of someone who had seen miles. Most people couldn't imagine. As he stepped fully into the light, Danielle saw the tangled beard streaked with gray, the creases carved deep into his face like battle lines, and the tattoos that wrapped up his forearms like old stories no one dared to ask about. But what stopped her breath was his eyes, ice blue-rimmed red, not with anger, but with something far more fragile, grief. The few regulars left in the diner stiffened. At the window, old Mrs. Lancaster clutched her pearls, whispering a prayer beneath her breath. A trucker by the corner lowered his coffee, narrowing his eyes. Even the radio, humming low with country gospel, crackled into static, as if unsure how to soundtrack what was unfolding. But the man ignored them all. He walked with slow purpose toward the farthest stool from the crowd and sat down, his shoulders drawing inward, not out of fear, but as if trying to disappear. Danielle stood for a second too long before her father's voice echoed in her memory. Soft but sure, everyone's money spins the same baby girl. But how you treat people, that's your legacy. Swallowing her nerves, she grabbed a menu, poured a glass of water, and walked to him with the same practiced calm she used on terminal patients. "Welcome to Brooklyn Table," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Today's special is chicken fried steak with sweet corn mash and buttermilk biscuits. Made it fresh this morning." The man looked up slowly, and for a moment, time paused. Those pale eyes weren't looking for a fight. They were searching for something else, perhaps. Peace or mercy. "Coffee," he rasped. Voice gravelly, yet worn down, black, whatever's hot. Danielle nodded, pouring from the dented silver pot behind the counter. As she placed the mug before him, her gaze fell to his hands, scarred, calloused, trembling faintly. And just beneath the cuff of his sleeve, a bright blue hospital bracelet peeked out like a silent cry. Her heart clenched. She had seen that look too many times in the oncology wing. The look of someone who had nothing left but the ride home. "Long road ahead?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her, just stared into the swirl of black in his mug. "Heading back to Fairview Medical," he muttered. "My daughter. They started something new. Don't know if it'll work." His voice broke on the word daughter, and Danielle felt her breath hitch. She didn't ask for more. She just nodded and said, "Toast and eggs coming right up. 6 minutes tops." And as she turned away to call the order, the silence behind her wasn't hostile anymore. It was just heavy with the ache of two strangers quietly holding on. The counter. When the diner door jingled again this time, the sound sharper, more clipped like a warning shot, and the air changed in an instant. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She felt it in the sudden stillness, in the way Mrs. Lancaster hunched deeper into her cup, in the muttered curses of the trucker, whose hands twitched around his mug. Sheriff Rick Dalton had arrived, and trailing behind him in quieter steps was Deputy Amy Stone, her eyes already scanning the room like a nervous bird. Rick walked with a swagger that wasn't earned, but inherited a man born into authority and drunk on the comfort it gave him. His brown boots clicked against the tile with deliberate menace, and his wide frame seemed to expand as he spotted the biker hunched over his coffee at the end of the bar. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well, well," he boomed loud enough to make everyone flinch. "Didn't expect to see one of your kind this far off the interstate." Danielle's fingers tightened around a dish towel. The man next to her, Ghost as she had started calling him in her mind, didn't respond. He just lifted his mug and took a slow sip. The tremble in his hands nearly gone now. "Just having breakfast," he said. Lowly, not confrontational, just tired, not causing trouble. "No," Rick said, stepping closer, his belt creaking under the weight of his holster. "That patch says Different Iron Sons, huh? We've had bulletins about your boys, guns, drugs, God knows what else. Maybe I should check your ID. Make sure you're not the kind of problem that spreads." Danielle's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Her hands moved before her thoughts caught up. She stepped between Rick and Ghost, placing herself squarely in the sheriff's path. "He's a paying customer," she said, voice low but unshaking, "same as anyone else." Rick tilted his head at her like she'd just grown horns. "That right," he said, motioning toward Ghost's back. "You see that patch? You know what that means?" Danielle's pulse spiked, but her expression didn't waver. "I know what kindness looks like. I know what pain looks like. And I know what it doesn't look like." This Ghost finally looked up, his eyes locking with Rick's. "You don't know me," he said simply. "You don't know a damn thing about me." Rick let out a humorless laugh. "I know enough. I know not to trust a man wearing a skeleton on his back." And that was when Danielle made her choice. Not the easy one, not the smart one, but the right one. She reached across the counter, gently laid her hand between Ghost and the money he was pulling from his jacket, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Your money's no good here today. Breakfast is on me." The silence that followed was electric. Rick's mouth twitched, his pride bruised. He slammed a few crumpled bills onto the counter. "Let's go! Stone!" he barked, storming toward the door. Amy hesitated just for a second, her eyes flickering between Danielle and Ghost, with something that almost resembled remorse, then followed her superior out into the sunlit street. As the bell clanged behind them, Danielle stood motionless, breathing like she had just walked out of a fire. Behind her, Ghost said nothing, but when she looked his way, she saw the smallest shift in his face, something dangerously close to gratitude. The door had barely stopped swinging when the whispers began, soft, at first like wind rustling dry grass, then sharper, more pointed, as if each one carried a blade. Danielle didn't need to hear the words to know what they were. Biker lover, traitor, just like her daddy. Always stirring up trouble, She kept her back to them, scrubbing the already clean counter with the same force someone might use to scrub away shame. But it wasn't shame burning her cheeks. It was fury. Not at the townsfolk, not even at Sheriff Dalton, but at the smallness of it all. Their fear, their need to control what they didn't understand. She glanced at Ghost's plate, mostly untouched now and then, at the $20 he'd tried to leave tucked under the mug. "I told you it's on me," she murmured. "Can't take your last 20 for a meal. That wasn't even hot enough." Ghost said nothing, but his hand moved slowly, placing the bill back in his jacket. Then in a voice that sounded like gravel rolled in molasses, he finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that." Danielle looked at him, then meeting those pale, exhausted eyes. "Yes, I did," and she meant it. He nodded once, solemn, then stood adjusting the battered jacket on his shoulders. "Name's Calvin," he said. "Calvin Rivers." "Danielle Brooks," she replied softly. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Rivers." He gave her a small nod of respect, then turned and walked out into the relentless Texas sun, the door jangling shut behind him like punctuation on a chapter. Neither of them had planned. The diner fell into a heavy silence once more, but this time it was laced with something more dangerous than disapproval. Memory in towns like Fairview, people didn't forget. They didn't forgive quickly, and they certainly didn't look kindly on those who broke the unspoken rules of who deserved empathy. Hours passed in a slow crawl. Only one other customer came in, a traveler who didn't know better. And by the time Danielle flipped the open sign to closed, her tip jar held exactly $125 and a chewing gum wrapper. She sat in the corner booth where her father used to drink his late-night tea, resting her elbows on the formica table, and dropped her head into her hands. Outside, the summer sky deepened to orange, then purple, then black. It wasn't just a quiet day, it was a warning, and it would not be the last. The next morning broke with the kind of stillness that doesn't belong to peace but to judgment held in breath. Danielle arrived before dawn, as always, her keys jingling softly as she unlocked the front door of Brooklyn Table. The street was empty, but not silent, the kind of silence that hinted something was off. As she stepped inside and flicked on the lights, she caught movement from the corner of her eye. Her heart stopped. On the outside of the glass door, taped with crude strips of duct tape, was a bent, hand-cut piece of cardboard. Written across it in thick, angry red paint were the words, "No biker lovers, no troublemakers, no traitors." Danielle stood frozen for a moment, the letters burning into her eyes like flame. Her fingers curled into fists, but she didn't cry, she didn't rage. Instead, she stepped outside, ripped the sign down, with one sharp pull, walked to the rusted trash barrel behind the diner, lit a match, and watched the cardboard curl, blacken and vanish into ashes. But the message, its venom, remained seared into her memory like a scar. She returned inside, wiped her hands on her apron, and began her prep as usual, chopping onions, folding napkins, setting tables. But everything felt heavier, like each plate held the weight of invisible stares, each step echoed with unspoken accusations. And then she paused. Her eyes fell to the corner booth, the one her father had claimed as his kingdom, and she stood motionless, staring at the empty cushion where he used to sit. Strong hands wrapped around a chipped mug, always watching, always steady. If he had been here, he wouldn't have told her to back down. He would have said, "Make the coffee, feed the hungry. Let the cowards talk." So that's what she did. She brewed the strongest pot she had wiped down every inch of the diner until it shone and opened her doors like it was just another morning. But the truth was clear. This wasn't about coffee anymore. It was about a line she had crossed, and Danielle Brooks knew better than most. Once you cross a line in a place like Fairview, there's no going back, only forward. Diner under a sky smeared in bruised purple and fading gold, she drove straight to Fairview Medical Center, a familiar route her hands could steer in sleep. The parking lot was quiet, bathed in a dull yellow glow from flickering street lamps, and the halls inside smelled like antiseptic and silence. She walked past the nurse's station with a nod. Everyone here knew her. Not as Danielle from Brooklyn Table, but as the daughter of Walter Brooks, the man who once brought homemade peach pie to the night staff and shook every janitor's hand like they were governors. She paused outside room 203, the one at the end of the corridor that never changed no matter the season. The door creaked as she eased it open, revealing the dimly lit shape of her father, lying still beneath a thin hospital blanket, hooked up to the slow robotic breath of machines that had become his voice since the stroke stole everything but presence. Danielle crossed the room quietly and took his hand. still warm, still strong, despite the fragility of the rest of him. "Hey, Daddy," she whispered, her voice catching in the back of her throat. "It's me, your troublemaker daughter." She smiled to herself, the kind that hurts more than heals. "Rough day at the diner. I may have accidentally on purpose pissed off the sheriff." Her thumb moved gently along the back of his hand, tracing the same soothing circles he used to make on her back when she was sick. "There was a man, big guy, biker looked like hell. Most folks saw a threat. I saw a dad, I saw grief, and the cops, they saw the patch on his back and nothing else." Her voice dropped cracked, so I stepped in. "Because that's what you taught me to do." The monitors beeped on uncaring, but she kept talking. "Now the town's mad, they think I betrayed them. Someone taped a sign on the door, said I'm a traitor for giving a man a plate of food." She let out a tired laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Guess feeding people ain't always safe these days." She stared at the folds in his blanket for a long moment. "But you told me to judge a person by their actions, not their clothes. You said kindness isn't a favor, it's a duty, and maybe I scared them, Daddy. Maybe I scared myself a little too. But I didn't back down." Her eyes welled, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed the back of his hand. "Sleep well tonight. I've got the diner, and I've still got your spine." And with that, Danielle stood, gave his hand one last squeeze, and walked out into the quiet hospital corridor, carrying her father's legacy like armor into a town that had just started to turn cold. The next day arrived, like a ghost hollow, still watching Danielle unlock the diner before the sun had fully risen, the air outside hanging thick with a tension she could feel on her skin. She had burned the hateful cardboard sign behind the building last night, watching it curl into ash like a curse reversed. But no fire could erase what it meant. Fairview had chosen its side, and it wasn't hers. Inside Brooklyn Table, she moved with the quiet of someone bracing for impact. Coffee brewed, biscuits baked, tables were cleaned twice over. But time passed, and the door never opened. Not at 7, not at 8. By 9, the coffee sat cold and untouched, the register drawer still as empty as her tip jar. Danielle found herself wiping clean counters just for the sake of doing anything, to drown out the silence pressing in from every corner. Not a single familiar face walked through that door. Not Mrs. Lancaster with her morning crossword. Not the Trucker twins who always split a steak and eggs. Not even Mr. Mallory who once claimed he'd die without her peach jam. They had all disappeared not by accident, but by choice. It wasn't just a boycott, it was a message. Danielle stood behind the register at noon, arms crossed over her apron, watching dust motes swirl in the sunlight like falling confetti at a funeral. Every minute that ticked by whispered another question she didn't want to answer. How long can I keep this up? When does the principal stop paying the bills? What if I am alone in this? The bell over the door finally rang. She looked up so quickly her neck nearly snapped, half hoping it was a delivery, half dreading another warning. But instead, two strangers stepped inside, a man and a woman, mid-50s, weathered, worn, sunburnt, and proud. The man's jacket bore a small silver skull pin, subtle but unmistakable, and on the woman's denim vest, patched clean across the back, glinted the insignia Danielle would now never forget: Iron Sons. MC, she blinked uncertain. The couple walked forward with calm, respectful steps until the man stopped in front of her and extended a hand. "Danielle Brooks?" he asked. She nodded slowly, the old tension creeping back into her spine. "I'm Roy Rivers," he said. "This is my wife, Linda Calvin's brother." Her breath hitched, the biker ghost. Roy gave her a firm, weathered handshake. Warm, steady human. "He told us what happened here," Linda added gently. "He wanted to come himself, but—" "He's still with his daughter, Danielle," whispered Lila. "Right," Roy's face clouded. "Stage 4. They're trying something experimental. It's the last shot." Danielle's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry. He said you were kind." Linda continued, her voice a quiet echo, "that when everyone else looked at the patch, you looked at the man." Danielle lowered her gaze. He didn't seem like he needed a fight. He needed a meal. Roy smiled faintly. "Sometimes those are the same thing." Danielle moved toward the coffee pot. "Can I offer you a cup?" Linda smiled. "We'd love that." She poured the coffee with steady hands, but something in their presence made her heart flutter, like wind through dry grass. Something in the way they looked at her as if she were part of something bigger than Fairview, bigger than fear. When Roy finished his cup, he set it down gently. "We wanted to thank you. Not with money," he said, raising a hand. "With support." Danielle tilted her head, puzzled. Support's Roy's lips quirked into a grin. "Give it a few minutes." And then she heard it, a low, distant rumble like thunder rolling across sun-baked hills. But it wasn't the weather, it was the engines. A wall of them, coming closer, louder. Until the very bones of Brooklyn Table began to hum. Danielle stepped to the window and saw the horizon shimmer with chrome motorcycles. Dozens, no hundreds, her breath caught. Something bigger had arrived, and it was wearing leather. Danielle stood rooted to the floor, heart pounding as the street outside transformed before her eyes. From both ends of Main Street they came rows upon rows of motorcycles, their chrome glinting in the sun like a wave of armor. The sound of roaring engines filled the town like a battle cry. But there was no chaos, no recklessness. Instead, there was rhythm, precision, purpose. Bikers, men and women of all ages, all colors, pulled in from every direction, parking in coordinated lines, stepping off their rides with the solemnity of a funeral procession and the pride of an army. Some bore flags fluttering in the wind, others held small bouquets. All of them wore jackets and vests marked with Iron Suns, MC Steel Guardians, Broken Saints, and other clubs. Danielle had only heard whispered in late-night diners and roadside gas stations. She stared speechless as the parking lot overflowed. The sidewalk vanished beneath booted feet, and the air turned electric with presence. She turned slowly toward Roy. "What is this?" she breathed. Linda stepped beside her, laying a steady hand on her shoulder. "Calvin told his chapter about you," she said, eyes warm. "They told others. And in our world, word travels fast. You treated one of ours with dignity. That means something." "But that's over 200 people," Danielle whispered, barely able to believe it. Roy's gaze was unwavering, because when the world turns its back on us, we remember the ones who didn't. The bell above the door rang again, and the first riders entered. Not loud, not cocky, respectful. They nodded to Danielle like she was royalty. They took seats-filled booths and leaned against the walls where chairs ran out. Some placed bouquets by the window. Others set folded handkerchiefs beside their plates. I don't have enough food," Danielle stammered, overwhelmed. "Not for this many, not even close." Roy grinned. "Taken care of. Linda called your suppliers last night. Trucks are en route, costs covered." Danielle blinked, the truth crashing over her like rain after drought. By who, she asked. Linda's answer was simple. By us. Call it an investment. In kindness. Across the street, the townsfolk gathered, stunned. They stared from porches, peeked through curtains, and whispered behind doors. Some clutched their chests, some stepped backward, but some stepped forward. Danielle's old classmate Malik crossed the road and stepped inside, wide-eyed and hesitant. He looked around, then raised a hand awkwardly. "You still serving those biscuits?" he asked with a crooked grin. Danielle blinked, then laughed a sharp, almost disbelieving sound. "Sure am, but you'll have to share a table." "Not a problem," Malik replied, sliding in beside a woman with a bright pink mohawk and a patch that read, "Reapers never quit more." Locals followed, slowly, cautiously. But they came, they sat, they ordered, they listened, they talked, conversations. Sparked tense at first, then easier. A kid asked a biker if he could sit on his Harley. A biker asked an old woman how she made her apple butter. The lines between them blurred. And Danielle, watching it all from behind the counter, felt something shift. Not just in her diner, but in her town. In her Brooklyn Table, once the loneliest place in Fairview, was suddenly the most alive it had ever been. By mid-afternoon, Brooklyn Table was bursting at the seams. Every booth was full, every stool was taken. Riders sat cross-legged on the floor, leaning against walls, swapping stories with locals over plates of burgers and pie. What had started as a quiet protest of dignity had become something deeper, a reunion of strangers who had only needed an excuse to find one another. Danielle moved through it all, like a conductor of a symphony no one had rehearsed, but everyone knew how to play. She refilled mugs without asking. She shouted orders to the kitchen now, manned by 2 teens from the local church who had shown up unprompted. She smiled through the ache in her feet, the tremble in her hands, the fire in her soul. And then just as the laughter began to settle into background music, the bell above the door rang one more time. Everything went still. Heads turned, forks froze, and Danielle, apron stained and hair falling from its tie, turned slowly toward the entrance. A man filled the doorway, massive and commanding. His beard was snow-white, thick as steel wool. His eyes, dark and steady, swept across the diner like a lighthouse beam. The leather vest stretched across his chest bore the bold, unmistakable words, President Iron Sons, MC Riverside. Chapter, "You must be Danielle," he said, voice like gravel coated in honey. She nodded, heartbeat thudding like a drum. "Name's Marcus Turner." He continued, stepping forward with a grin that felt like sunlight cracking through clouds. He reached out a hand. She took it firm and sure. "Welcome to Brooklyn Table," she said softly. "You've made quite an impression on the family," Marcus said. Then he turned to the room, raised one thick arm, and with just that gesture, the diner fell silent. "I came here to do one thing," he began to say. "Thank you, because when others turned their backs, Danielle didn't. When some saw a patch, she saw a father. And when power tried to intimidate, she stood her ground." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, heads nodded, boots tapped softly on the tile. Now in our world, Marcus continued, loyalty and respect mean something, they mean everything. So, I want it known, loud and clear. Brooklyn Table rides under the protection of Iron Sons, MC. The cheer that followed shook the walls, boots stomped, fists pounded tables, applause exploded like thunder rolling across mountains. Danielle stood, frozen, stunned, overwhelmed. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they found Calvin Rivers standing near the entrance jacket, dusty eyes rimmed red and a soft smile pulling at his lips. He nodded once, she nodded back, a tear finally slipping free. Marcus raised a hand again. "And if anyone in this town has a problem with that." His gaze flicked to the back, where Sheriff Rick Dalton had just stepped through the door. Hat in hand, face unreadable, Marcus's voice dropped into a steady growl. "Then they've got a problem with all of us." Another roar. But this time it wasn't just bikers cheering, it was locals too. Malik, the trucker twins. Even old Mrs. Lancaster clapped a wide grin on her face. Rick said nothing. He just looked around, nodded once, and stepped aside. And when the noise died down, Marcus turned back to Danielle with a glint in his eye. "Now," he said, grinning widely, "I heard your sweet potato pie could end wars. Any left back there?" Danielle laughed through the tears, wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, and pointed toward the kitchen. "You'd better move fast. These folks don't leave crumbs." And just like that, the storm became joy again. As sunlight stretched long shadows across the sidewalks of Fairview, the diner kept humming like an old jukebox brought back to life. Someone rigged a speaker to a bike battery and classic rock poured into the air, blending with the scent of seared meat, cinnamon, and motor oil. The once quiet town square now pulsed with something it hadn't known in years. Community children wove between chrome bikes like minnows, their laughter cutting through the tension that had ruled these streets only a day before. Elderly locals leaned on lampposts, sipping coffee from Brooklyn Table, to-go cups nodding to bikers they had once crossed the street to avoid. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Danielle stood at the diner's threshold, grease-streaked, flour-dusted, exhausted, and radiant. The vest clung to her shoulder now, like a second skin. "Friend of the Iron Sons, Brooklyn Table." The letters stitched in rich gold thread over black leather. They had given it to her after the last plate was served, folded carefully in a brown paper parcel. She had held it like a sacred cloth. On its back below the name of the diner, another smaller patch was stitched. Protected. Roy had said it simply, "You stood up when it counted. Most people don't." That vest now hung next to her father's old apron, and a faded photograph of him smiling behind the counter in the early 90s, his arm around a young Danielle holding a spatula like a sword. 2 generations of courage, side by side. By twilight, the kitchen buzzed with volunteers, kids from the youth group, former skeptics from the neighborhood, even 2 of the bikers who insisted they had done worse jobs in, worse heat. Plates flew, pies vanished. Someone started a domino game in the back corner, and old Mrs. Lancaster cackled so loudly it startled a biker into spilling his cola. Nobody minded. Even Deputy Amy Stone returned this time, in plain clothes, her badge left behind, her tension gone. She sat at the counter, accepted a coffee from Danielle, with a quiet nod, and said nothing, but her eyes were soft. She stayed for hours as the sky deepened to a velvet navy. Danielle walked outside and found Calvin Rivers leaning against a post, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the horizon. The hospital bracelet still hung loosely around his wrist, like a fragile promise, catching the glow of the street lamp above Lila's, showing signs of response, he said. Without turning, his voice was thick, heavy with awe and exhaustion. The treatment might be working. Danielle's heart soared. That's everything, Calvin. He turned to her, voice low and real. She wants to meet you. Said you sound like the kind of woman she hopes to be. Danielle blinked back tears, her throat tightening. I'd like that, she whispered. I'd like that a lot. Across the street, someone revved a bike and the kids squealed with laughter. Danielle looked around at the sea of jackets and townsfolk and mingled lives, and for the first time in forever, she didn't just feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was part of something. Something bigger than a town, bigger than fear. A place where kindness wasn't a weakness. It was armor. A voice called from inside, another order. Up, Danielle smiled at Calvin, squeezed his hand once, then turned back toward the diner. Behind her, Fairview stood changed, and in front of her, the counter was waiting. So, she did what she always did. She stepped up. The buzz of the day had finally begun to settle into a soft hum by the time the last slice of pie was plated and the final coffee pot drained. The sun had dipped behind the buildings, leaving behind a trail of amber light dancing across the chrome tanks parked along Main Street. Inside Brooklyn Table, laughter still lingered like perfume, soft and golden. Danielle leaned her weight against the counter, rubbing a sore spot in her lower back, watching as two bikers helped restack chairs, while Malik showed a teenage girl with a nose ring how to wipe down the booths, Fairview style. Then the bell jingled one final time. She turned instinctively and froze. Sheriff Rick Dalton stood in the doorway, alone, hat in his hands. No gun belt, no badge. Just a man stripped of everything but pride and something that looked suspiciously like shame. The diner quieted again, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. What would he do now, in a room he no longer controlled? He approached the counter slowly. Danielle didn't flinch. Coffee? She asked flatly. Rick nodded. Please. She poured him a mug, set it down without ceremony. He wrapped his fingers around the cup, like a man who needed grounding. Good turnout, he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. She replied, neither cold nor warm, just steady. Rick looked into his cup, as if answers might swirl in the black liquid. Town's changing, he said. Finally, Danielle didn't argue. She didn't comfort either. She just reached for a clean towel and resumed wiping the counter, letting the silence say what words couldn't. Around them, the diner breathed on alive with the thrum of people who had chosen courage over comfort. Rick took a sip, said nothing more. Maybe he wouldn't apologize. Maybe he didn't know how. But sometimes the act of showing up, of drinking the coffee poured by the hand you once tried to silence, was a start. Danielle glanced up once more, met his eyes for a moment, then went back to her work. Forgiveness she knew was earned, not begged, and Fairview still had a long road to walk. But at least now they were finally taking the first step. In the days that followed, Brooklyn Table no longer echoed with emptiness. It thrived. The diner that once fought to keep its lights on now flickered late into the evening, its windows glowing with warmth, laughter, and the occasional biker patch catching the lamplight like a badge of honor. The hum of motorcycles on Fairview's quiet streets became familiar. Even welcome locals returned slowly but surely, curiosity melting into conversation, hesitation, dissolving over shared biscuits and endless cups of coffee. Mrs. Lancaster came back not with pearls clutched, but with a new blueberry cobbler recipe and questions for Linda about how to properly wear leather without sweating like a pig. Joe Mallory brought his grandkids to meet the real-life bikers and left with stories and selfies he never expected to cherish. Deputy Amy Stone became a regular, not in uniform, but in spirit. She stopped wearing the badge into the diner and started asking questions instead of giving orders. Danielle never said anything about it, but every time Amy left a tip or refilled her own coffee, Danielle gave her a nod of respect. And through it all, Danielle remained the constant pulse of it. All the anchor, she poured coffee with a smile that no longer hid pain. She flipped pancakes with speed and purpose. She laughed. She listened. She lived. She hung Calvin's hospital bracelet beside her father's apron, now encased in glass just above the register, labeled Simply. For those who stay standing, word spread beyond Fairview. Travelers from out of town came to see the little diner that stood up to fear and found family in rebellion. Social media posts buzzed with tags like Wininger Brooklyn, Table Strong, and Protected by Iron Sons. Biker clubs from across the state made it a point to roll through every few weeks, not out of duty, but affection. Some nights Danielle stood outside after closing arms, crossed loosely eyes on the stars, listening to the last engines roar down the highway. And sometimes Calvin Rivers would join her, his daughter Lila's laughter echoing from the corner booth inside. The new treatment had bought her time, and Danielle had given her faith. "You changed this town," Calvin told her once, voice low. "No," she said quietly. "We just reminded it who it could be, because this wasn't just about bikers, or one breakfast, or even one stand against power. This was about what happens when you decide on the worst day in the smallest town, behind the weakest counter, that you still believe in. People that kindness is worth the risk, that seeing someone truly seeing them matters, and that one plate of food can change the course of everything, one cup of coffee at a time." The vest hung beside the old photograph, like a silent sentinel, black leather, gold thread, and memory stitched into every seam. Visitors often paused at it, first their eyes tracing the embroidered words, "Brooklyn Table, Friend of the Iron Sons." But for Danielle, it was never just a gift, it was a vow. Each morning before unlocking the door, she'd take one quiet moment to glance at that vest, then at her father's apron, yellowed with age but still proud in posture. Two symbols, one legacy. Stand for something or fall for anything. The diner's walls had become a collage of moments. Polaroids pinned by regulars, handwritten thank you notes from visitors, patches mailed from clubs she'd never met, but who knew her name? There was one in particular, a tiny pink patch from a children's hospital in Houston, stitched by patients. It read, "For Lila's Angel." Danielle kept that one closest to the register, just below her tip jar. She never told anyone, but some days when the wait returned, when the town still gave side eyes or whispered in markets, she'd rest her fingers on that patch and remember why she did. What she did, Calvin came by more often now, sometimes alone, sometimes with Lila, who had started coloring little drawings of motorcycles and hanging them on the diner's fridge. Danielle had offered to pay her in pancakes, and Lila had bargained for chocolate chips every time. "She's doing better," Calvin said one Thursday afternoon, after a plate of hash browns and a full pot of coffee. "Not cured, but laughing again. And that means something." Danielle smiled a soft, grateful curve. "Laughter is half the medicine," she said. "Pie's the other half." Outside, another small group of bikes rolled into town. Not a roar this time, but a purr. New riders, new stories. They came in not as strangers, but as family, welcomed with nods from locals and a place at the long table near the window, now unofficially known as the Reaper's Corner. A woman from the city stepped in, phone in hand, curiosity in her eyes. "Are you the woman from the biker story?" she asked a little hesitant Danielle, simply pointed to the vest. "That story belongs to a lot of people, I just served the coffee." And as the woman sat down, Danielle moved behind the counter, pulled 2 fresh mugs from the warmer, and poured without asking. Because at Brooklyn Table, you didn't need to be understood, to be welcomed, you just needed to show up, hungry, hopeful, and willing to be seen. The seasons changed. Summer gave way to amber leaves and the crisp bite of fall. But Brooklyn Table never grew cold again. The warmth now came not just from the griddle or the coffee pot, but from what the place had become. It was no longer just a diner on the corner of a judgmental town. It was a beacon, a gathering place for outcasts, loyalists, skeptics, believers, for anyone brave enough to sit across from someone different and share a story. Over a warm plate, Danielle found herself writing less on the menus and more in the margins of her own life. She'd begun keeping a notebook under the counter, a journal of sorts filled with names, moments, quotes that struck her. You don't change minds by yelling at them. You change them by listening while they eat. That one came from a former Army medic named Toby, who now wore an Iron Sons patch and cried at the smell of cornbread. On Saturdays, Calvin and Lila helped run Peace Brunch, a now weekly gathering where local teachers, farmers, and riders broke bread, played music, and shared life lessons. The sheriff hadn't come back, but Deputy Amy had become a silent partner, helping coordinate supply deliveries, smoothing tensions, and making damn good scrambled eggs when Danielle needed a break. Danielle never asked her to apologize. She never needed it. Actions had already spoken louder. One day, a group of high school students came in with a camera crew, part of a project titled American Towns That Change Themselves. They interviewed Danielle in front of her father's photo. "What made you stand up that day?" a student asked, holding a mic too close. Danielle looked down at her hands calloused, flour-dusted, strong, and then at the table where the first confrontation had happened. "Because kindness isn't weakness," she said simply. "It's the fiercest kind of strength." That clip went viral, but Danielle didn't care about that. What mattered more was the older woman who came in 2 weeks later, all the way from Georgia with her grandsons and a framed letter Calvin had written to her daughter's doctor. He said, "You reminded him people are worth the fight," she said. Danielle offered her a seat, poured her coffee, and slid over the biscuit basket. No charge, just a plate, a smile, and a place to belong. Brooklyn Table had become more than a restaurant. It had become a living, breathing answer to a question the world seemed too afraid to ask. What if we just chose to see each other? And day by day, plate by plate, that answer grew louder. It was just past closing, when the final bell above the door jingled that night, soft like a memory. Danielle had sent the last of the volunteers home and stood alone in the warm hush of Brooklyn Table, wiping down the pass-through window. One last time, the radio played a low, bluesy tune. Outside, the streets of Fairview were quiet, bathed in a soft glow from the lampposts. And then Calvin walked in one hand tucked into his jacket, the other gently guiding Lila, now walking stronger. A scarf wrapped around her head and eyes full of mischief. "Told you she stays late," he whispered to his daughter. Lila giggled. "I brought her something," she said, holding a small box in both hands. Danielle knelt as Lila approached, setting the box on the counter with a dramatic flourish. Inside was a bracelet leather, hand-braided with a tiny silver charm in the shape of a coffee mug. Etched into its side were the words, "Heart First." Always Danielle's throat tightened as she held it. "You made this?" Lila nodded proudly. Daddy said, "You saved more than breakfast that day." Danielle looked to Calvin, and for the first time his eyes weren't heavy with grief. They were bright with peace. "We're heading back to Atlanta," he said. "She's going into full treatment, new hospital. But we'll be back. This is home now, too." Danielle hugged them both, tight, not goodbye, but see you later. And after they left, she stood alone for a while in the doorway, watching the shadows of their departure stretch down the road like long promises. Inside, she turned off the lights one by one. Before flipping the last switch, she walked to the wall, straightened her father's apron, adjusted the Iron Son's vest, and placed Lila's bracelet on the hook between them. Past, present, legacy, love. As the final light clicked off and the door locked behind her, Danielle knew the story didn't end here. It never would. Not as long as there was a table to set, a voice to lift, or a stranger to welcome. In a world too quick to judge, too scared to trust this diner, her diner would remain what it had become, a sanctuary where everyone was seen, served, and safe. And maybe that's how you change the world, not with speeches, not with power, but with a plate of food, a strong backbone, and a heart that refuses to look away, one cup of coffee at a time, in a world too quick to judge and too slow to understand. Danielle didn't back down. She stood up, not with fists, not with force, but with kindness, conviction, and a plate of food. And in return, the world stood with her, because sometimes the loudest revolutions begin in the quietest places, with a coffee pot, a leather vest, and a heart that refuses to look away. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of doing what's right, even when it's hard, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe to Flow Story for more true stories that heal, unite, and awaken something deeper in all of us. One story, one soul at a time,